Hello and welcome to episode 30 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my life's dream and career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. And this week my guest is Danny Eccleston, senior editor of MOJO magazine. Not only is he a huge Weller fan, he's also the chap who's been working with Paul Weller over the past few months on a very special edition of the magazine with Paul as guest editor. Danny will tell us how it all came together and share stories of some key interviews from Wildwood right up to now, along with a love of the music from the Jam to the Style Council, solo, and so much more. So let's get into it. Hey, Danny, thanks for joining us.
A pleasure.
This is literally hot off the press, this news that we're going to talk about in a sec. But before we get into MOJO and June 2021, I want to get into the wellerness of you and how much you love the man. So this is going to be a little bit of a test, but can you remember the first time that you heard of the music of Paul Weller? And what did it mean to you?
Oh, I think it would probably have been something like Going Underground. It would have been those 1980 singles, Going Underground, That's Entertainment, Start, and the Sound Effects album. I think that, I would have been 12. So that would have been a kind of classic. I would have said that's a classic age for getting into the Jam, really. I remember talking to Paul Weller once about young fans of the Jam. And he kind of once said to me, yeah, we were a real playground band, he said. There was like us and Madness and the Specials and a couple of others. And as soon as he said it, of course, it kind of, all these memories came flooding back of like, yes, kids in the playground, turning their school ties so the thin bit was at the front.
Yeah.
Trying to like get your mum to take in your school trousers and, sort of cutting bits off your lapels of your jacket, things like that. Anything to make you a bit kind of more Jam friendly, Jam centric kind of thing. So yeah, so it would have been the Jam. I bought a couple of those singles, but I didn't buy a Jam album, oddly, until Dig the New Breed, the live album. I think that was just maybe being a bit kind of tight, I think. And then I kind of investigated back and bought In the City and all ModCons and all that. And I just got really, really, really into the Style Council.
Oh, right.
Like probably in a way that more into the Style Council than I'd ever been into the Jam. I wouldn't say necessarily the Style Council are per se better than the Jam, but they were just my band. And it was partly because of the time, because I was a bit older then. I think what the Style Council represented were all the things that I was like really into at that time. So the politics was really, really important to me. My family were very political. It was like a political background I came from. So all the left-wing stuff I loved. The jazz and soul stuff I really took on board. It was really the start of also Paul offering that kind of open door to lots of kind of culture and influences that you might not know about. So it was like a manual or a kind of A to Z to likes of lots of cool stuff like Colin McInnes and Curtis Mayfield and, Philly Soul and stuff that I just wouldn't have known about if I hadn't been paying attention to what Paul Weller was saying.
Was it all the way through? Were you there from Cafe Blur right through to modernism?
No, I have to say that The Cost of Loving was definitely a kind of a bit of a disconnect for me. That was where it's not that I hadn't appreciated that kind of 80s techno soul kind of stuff. I liked like Arif Mardin productions. I liked Scritti Politti when they went kind of Arif Mardini in 1985. I liked stuff like those Jam and Lewis productions like Change Your Heart, that kind of thing. What I didn't want from the Style Council. And I was actually talking to Mick Talbot about this recently, just to drop a name. And
he rang me the other day. It's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. We're all being rung up by Mick Talbot at all hours of the day. And he was saying, yeah, he thought that unprompted, I hadn't mentioned my feelings about Cost of Loving. He said that's definitely where he felt that they lost quite a few people. And we had a bit of a chat about why he thought that was. And he said, well, we were committed to that record. I think we kind of decided that what it wasn't was this kind of fusion that previous Star Council records had been, or the Star Council at their best, brought together like different genres of music and glued them together and made something unique. Whereas I think Cost of Loving was kind of more of a straight homage to a particular style of what was then very contemporary American soul music. And if you didn't like that, or, you know, you could only stomach so much of it, then it just wasn't for you. And I think his point there was that it kind of broke the connection for a lot of people. So, you know, looking back, Confessions of a Pop Group, once I became a music journalist and it became my job to kind of reassess music, I had to take my hat off to it. It's a really, really amazing record, I think. And I think in the spirit of the Star Council proper, in the sense that it brought lots of elements together and created something unique. And, you know, obviously I didn't hear Modernism, A New Decade, until it came out with the box set, you know, in the 90s, like everybody. You know, it's all right. But no, I'm kind of, our favourite shop is where it kind of is the peak for me. But I just love all the stuff before that as well. All the early singles. Long Hot Summer was just a really, really key record for me. Head Start for Happiness, You're the Best Thing, you know, all that stuff. Fantastic.
And at which point did you decide then a career in music and a career as a music journalist was for you?
Well, I kind of did that thing where I fortunately went to university, had the opportunity to work on the university newspaper, and kind of was convinced, because I'd read, you know, the news music papers for so long, that I knew exactly how to do that in that kind of arrogant way that young people have. And then I found out it was a profession, or rather something adjacent to a profession, and that it was something I could do and get paid for. And that's what I've done ever since. Ever since I left university, I've worked for music magazines. Been very lucky.
And you've pretty much demolished all of them along the way as far as Mojo is concerned. Everything else doesn't really exist anymore in terms of a proper
I thought you meant magazine. I'd closed all the magazines I'd worked on. I was about to say only some of them, Dan.
That wasn't quite what I meant, no. But Mojo really stands out for me as an incredible magazine. I mean, it's a joy when that arrives through the letterbox every month, I have to say. So how long have you been at Mojo? How long has that been your gig?
Since 2004. So before that, I was at Q from about 96. Before that, I had a stint on the NME along with an apprenticeship on musicians magazines, which people find unusual, but I always say is a really good thing to have done. Not only is it a fantastic sector and the great titles that have really stood the test of time. I worked on a magazine called Guitarist and a magazine called Drummers called Rhythm. It means that even now I can, if an interview is going a bit tits up, I can still ask, "Oh, what's that pedal you've got there?" and somehow the "what's that pedal you've got there" question, often you get a funny look, which is like, "What, you know what this pedal is? Well, do you know what it does?" kind of thing. And then two things happen. One, it means that the artist knows that you're not necessarily just wanting to know who they're sleeping with today. They kind of realize that you have some interest in the way music's put together and some kind of accrued knowledge about it, or at least in passion for how music sounds. Always find that puts me on the good side with people. And the first time I interviewed Paul Weller was for a guitar magazine, a magazine called The Guitar Magazine, it was called. It was for his Wildwood album, at a point where not everyone was interviewing Paul Weller, because he was still kind of rehabilitating, I suppose, or it was still perceived that he had some rehabilitation to do. I mean, I'd seen the Paul Weller movement live, and I'd really liked that first solo record. So I knew, as did many of us, of course, that he was back on it, doing great work. And then Wildwood came along, and of course, if you were listening, it was phenomenal. It was, a total mind-blowing record. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to talk to him. And I think it's quite funny. I think that I remember the negotiations around the interview, and they said, "Well, you'll be putting Paul on the cover then, won't you?" I remember we couldn't, because I said, "We can't put Paul on the cover because we've got a Paul McCartney interview. And this goes back to Paul Weller. And it comes back again. And we're going, well, as long as it's Paul McCartney on the cover, then that's okay. Paul will play second fiddle to Paul McCartney. And the funny thing is, I think ever since, one of the good things about Paul Weller is he'll always defer to Paul McCartney. You know, even now, there's not many people he'll defer to, but he will defer to Paul McCartney. So yeah, so we got the Paul Weller interview, and I went down to the Manor Studios in Oxfordshire, which was a beautiful place, you know, a real privilege to have been there while great music was being made there, while it was open. And it was just a beautiful spot. And it was a real eye-opener for me. It was obviously the first time I'd interviewed Paul Weller, but I remember him like showing me all these records that he was like playing, and it was Freeze, Fire and Water. There was a Grant Green jazz guitar album. There was Five Leaves Left by Nick Drake. And this was a point where Nick Drake revival was still it was still early days for the Nick Drake revival. It was like suddenly I was going, oh my God, Paul, you're a hippie, you know, and it was like, yeah, you know, he kind of was holding his hands up, you know, that it really was the first time that he'd allowed some of this really hairy music across his transom kind of thing. And it was the start, I think it was the start, you know, it was one of his many kind of points where he takes stock musically and kind of allows a load of new influences in, and it kind of refreshes his way forward. You know, so I think that observers of Paul Weller will note that there are many, many fantastic records, but there are key records when there's a stock taking and a move on. You know, I think of 22 Dreams a bit like that. You know, that's a record where I feel like a new phase kicked in, kind of experimentalism and eclecticism. Wildwood was another one of those. Yeah, I remember him making me a cup of tea, and I was just thinking, wow, pop stars never made me a cup of tea. This is quite impressive. Of course, I find out later it's something he always does. I mean, Ted Kessler mentions it in the new issue of MOJO. You know, here's a pop star that will do his round of brews kind of thing. And I think Paul thinks that kind of thing's important.
A few people have mentioned the tea making, and I'd love to know, you know, is it a strong cup of tea or a weak cup? Where does it sit in the pecking order? Can you remember?
I know it's strong but not too strong.
Oh, okay.
If you got a Pantone reference, I'll pick one out for you. No, it was a good cup of tea. It was obviously a man who makes tea and wasn't just kind of putting on like a tea making kind of pretense for the visitor.
Brilliant. There's a bit, to me, it's almost a bit like Doctor Who with these regenerations at different points. And
yes,
we've talked about these three different phases in the career in terms of the jam, the style counts on the solo years. And that's kind of one of the questions I get to at the end of this podcast every episode is you'll have to pick a song from one of those periods. But actually, when you talk about the solo years, we're talking 30 years on its own. And there are those points where you do feel that as a regeneration, like you say, that 22 Dreams comes up a lot. But we seem to be in a real period now where, I mean, the hit rate of the albums and the content and stuff that's coming out of Black Barn and out of Weller over the past few years, from A Kind Revolution to True Meanings to On Sunset and now this new record, it's remarkable, really, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's very few artists that have this, you know, of any age really, that have this kind of output. So, and other artists allude to it as well. It's not like just music journalists going, wow, he's at it again, he's made another record. You know, there's in the new MOJO, we talked to Kevin Shields from My Bloody Valentine, who appears on Wake Up the Nation, adding some of his trademark gnarly, ethereal, gnarly guitar sounds. And he was kind of amazed by how Weller's process, you know, sort of about how quickly he kind of gets like sort of ideas into his head and how quickly he can get them like sort of made, how quickly he gets sounds on tape, how quickly he's confident about something being the right thing, the wrong thing. There's not a lot of umming and ahhing. There's quite a lot of getting on with it. And I think that I'm sure that the death of his father, which he talks about a lot still, you know, it's not like something that, you know, happened and then that's in the past. He still talks about it quite a lot. And I think that whole sense of mortality and I've got to get all this stuff done because you never know what tomorrow might bring. I think that's key. I think he's kind of also realised that he's not someone who's got a load of hobbies. Do you know what I mean? He doesn't go fishing or go to the football. You know, he just likes music.
Yeah.
You know, so if he's not listening to it, he wants to be making it. So I think that, I mean, you're quite right. This recent splurge has been really amazing. And of course, lockdown has meant that he had more time than he thought he was going to have. You know, he was going to tour on Sunset. He was really looking forward to it.
We should get into the new issue because actually June 2021, MOJO, A New Man in Charge is the front cover. Paul Weller edits MOJO. And this is a great segue because I think and we'll talk about how that came about, but one of the bits that he talks about is on Sunset. And the quote is, "I had the perfect show designed in my mind," he says wistfully, "I still have it." So he was really looking forward to taking that album out on the road.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, obviously that became impossible. There's something that Stephen Craddock says in the same issue, actually. He said as soon as kind of lockdown was announced, you know, he immediately started worrying about Weller because he knew that Weller would find it exasperating, like beyond all other human beings, to be shackled in such a way. Weller does have the advantage of having his own studio that he can like sort of leg it down to. There was a lot of music making. And I think that I love this idea of the record being the new one, which is called Fat Pop Volume 1, as you and your pod listeners are probably already aware of. And his idea initially, though, was that he would release all the tracks as singles. It's typical of Weller to have a plan like this, you know, to go, right, okay, we'll do something different. They're all going to be singles, you know, and release them like singles, et cetera, et cetera. Then it was kind of pointed out to him that like people didn't really do singles anymore, which made him quite cross, I think, initially.
That's right, because he calls them impact. There's like a quote where he goes impacts tracks, and you can tell he's a bit like derogatory.
I mean, that's what the record industry tends to call these things now, impact tracks. Which means obviously you're not going down to the shop and buying 7 inches of vinyl. You're like, so you may be experiencing them as a video on YouTube or whatever. But the great thing is, of course, is he thinks of them as singles. So therefore, they have the qualities of singles. So while On Sunset and the previous record are both really great records, they're kind of shaped conceptually to have a kind of, you know, arc and curve and work as albums. This record's full of like these really kind of spiky, urgent, pithy kind of postcards from lockdown kind of thing, because he's thinking in your face melody. It's like a single would have been. It's a really, really different approach, and the songs all feel really different from each other. And there's a level of kind of excitement sustained throughout the record. So I think it's admirable. I think they're great songs, and it does feel different. They do feel different for having been conceptualized as singles.
Right, interesting. So how did it come about? How did Paul Weller become your new boss, essentially?
How did he become the boss? Well, I kind of had it in my mind for a while that Paul Weller should be a guest editor of MOJO.
Because there haven't been many, have there?
There haven't been many. The first one was David Bowie, which I think might have swayed Weller to think that it might be worthwhile doing. And then we've had Tom Waits, Noel Gallagher, and we've had Keith Richards. And I think in every case, there are people that not only have they're obviously great musicians and record makers in their own right, but they all have a kind of world that they reference and that they are keen to bring to their fans. So Bowie famously would always bang on about the Pretty Things and the Velvet Underground and Syd Barrett and the legendary Stardust Cowboy, and people that his fans didn't really know anything about, but he would introduce them to. You know, he was humble enough to kind of say, well, you know, you like me, but what about these guys? You should check them out. And I think all the other musicians we mentioned there too are like, so obviously fans, as much as they are great musicians. And I think that's the important quality to have if you're, you know, it's kind of like you've got to be a fan and you've got to have an interest in hipping people to music you like if you're going to be a good guest editor for MOJO. Yeah. So I always thought that Weller would be good at that because that's what he's always done. We've mentioned that before about how, you know, he opens the door and it's like, oh, look, there's the Isley Brothers, fantastic. Or Blue Note Jazz or this, that, and the other. When I interviewed him for On Sunset, I was lucky enough to kind of become one of those people that he would text for a short while, well, I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter. Paul, I'm not bitter. But no, but it's good because, you'd become one of these people who just go, I've just heard this. It's amazing. Check it out, kind of thing. And, and you'd be drawn into this relationship where you wanted to tell him about stuff that you'd heard. And there was this amazing Andrew Hill jazz CD from 1969 on Blue Note that he insisted I listen to. And it's called Lift Every Voice. And it's a jazz record, but it's also got choir on it. So it's kind of got this kind of gospel-y kind of vibe, which I think Weller really loves gospel music, and he loves soul music that's very gospel-y. And I remember thinking, well, anyone who can talk about the Small Faces, but also talk about Andrew Hill, has the kind of world that, the Mojo reader would appreciate. So, so I suggested, why don't you become a guest editor this month? So, we'll talk about your album, but it's also a collaboration where you suggest other music and artists that we cover in the magazine, and we'll run some ideas past you and say, do you want this in your magazine, Paul? So that means it's a magazine that's not just got Paul Weller in it. It's got a big piece on McCartney's Ram, which Weller really rates, obviously because he loves Paul McCartney. And we've got a Kevin Shields interview. We've got a piece on Funkadelic's Maggot Brain to kind of reflect that side of what Paul's into. Paul suggested insisted, shall we say, that we cover Declan O'Rourke and the Mysterines in the front section as harsh to say of Declan O'Rourke to call him a rising artist, but because he's been around so long. But sort of he needs a bit of an extra push, and Paul's there to do it. He's produced the record, and he's kind of gone, come on, Mojo, give the guy some love. So it's fair enough because he's good. Declan O'Rourke is good. It's like there's none of your rubbish is being touted here. And again, there's some of those surprising things that so Mojo has a section that we call Buried Treasure. Every month, it's a record that, it's not from the mainstream. It's not something that people might not know about it. Paul suggested that we do the Third Ear Band's music from Macbeth, which is a film soundtrack by the Third Ear Band from the 70s. And it's really kind of weird, spooky, avant-garde rock music. And again, sort of not on a list of records that you would immediately associate with Paul Weller, but Weller's really into it. It's an interesting story, and it's really weird and interesting music. And, it's kind of a win-win. It's great Mojo content, which Paul Weller has volunteered. And then, our How to Buy section this month is devoted to Ghostbox, which is the small British label with lots of strange, haunting music on and that Paul's really into. And he's made records with the Ghostbox people, and the Ghostbox people have been on his records. So again, it's like up here you got Paul McCartney, and down here you've got Ghostbox. And so we feel like it's great. It's a simpatico collaboration between Mojo and Paul Weller, and it's turned out really well.
Yeah, it's a proper musical journey that you take us on in this issue. And I've had a little sneak preview, and there's one bit around the Coral, which is great, which was a guide to the Coral, but particularly around their record label. So we're all aware of, the Coral and In the Morning and all those kind of tracks and Paul's love of them. But what I hadn't quite realized is this connection with the record label that is run by James out of there, and the stuff that's coming out of there, and Weller's love of Liverpool as a music city and things like that comes through in that article, which is really lovely too.
Weller's like a closet Scouser, I think. It's like in a different. He was maybe he's reincarnated from a reincarnated Scouser. I mean, he says in this little piece about the Skeleton Key label, which, as you say, is the Coral Singer's own record label. He says that it's quite intimidating playing in Liverpool. This is already a bit of a revelation that Paul Weller's intimidated by anything, but let alone kind of, playing a gig, which, kind of meat and drink to him. But he says he's quite intimidated whenever he plays Liverpool, because he kind of looks out into the crowd and thinks, God, any one of these guys probably plays better guitar than me. I mean, he's just got that kind of respect for the kind of magical aura of Liverpool as a music town. He's been visiting it for long enough. I mean, there are certain cities that musicians feel like they have these relationships with, that where you go and you're embraced more than you are in other places. And I think he feels like that about Liverpool.
I'm guessing there's also the Macca connection, the Beatles connection with Liverpool as well. And you mentioned, is Paul on Paul, Weller on Macca, a lifelong bromance is the headline. And this idea that the Beatles taught him everything musically, but also about the power of imagination is what Paul says. And talking about Ram, Macca's second solo album, but there's a couple of stories in there. One around, talk about being intimidated, one around Come Together, which was the for the Help album. I'm trying to remember the year, it would have been like mid-90s, I'm guessing. And they invited Macca down to play on that as part of was it the Smoking Mojo Filters, I think was the band. It was Noel Gallagher and Weller and a couple of others, I think. But
yes, we've never sued. We've never sued.
He talks about, I think again, about being intimidated, or the fact that they kind of put their track down before Macca got there because they were worried about them being crap or being found out in terms of not being talented enough, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's him and Steve Craddock and, a few other guys. It wasn't a shoe-in that McCartney was going to contribute to the Come Together track. Weller says that it was Mary McCartney that eventually persuaded McCartney that he needed to do it.
Right.
And so when they found out that McCartney was going to actually be on the track, be in the studio with them, they decided that they were going to have to sort of make sure that they had a safety net. So they put in quite a bit of work and made sure that the majority of the track was kind of ready for when he arrived. And he came in and played some Wurlitzer and a bit of guitar and this, that, and the other on it, and did some backing vocals. Weller describes himself as being pretty much bricking it, actually.
Yes, that's it. We were shitting ourselves, he says. Yeah.
So and I mean, it's a great version of Come Together, for a great cause. And it was kind of like one of those real moments in British pop music. Certainly one of the key moments of 90s music in the UK, because the Beatles had been, in a way, they'd been kind of written out of the picture. The 80s weren't kind to them. They weren't particularly revered during the 80s. Like hit musicians would reference the Byrds or Velvet Underground, maybe even like 65 to 66 Stones, not necessarily the Beatles. The Beatles are like too tarred with the brush of being your mum's favorite pop group. But, so obviously that didn't mean anything to Paul Weller. And of course it didn't mean anything to Noel Gallagher either. They were both, sort of absolutely fans of the Beatles and would not be deterred from that. And of course, the 90s was beginning to see the point of the Beatles. So Oasis, where Paul was going in his solo career, and a load of other bands kind of followed down that route. Probably too many bands ultimately followed them down that route. But no, the whole Beatle revival, was at least partly to do with what Noel Gallagher and Paul Weller were doing in the 90s.
There's a lovely bit around, and I won't spoil the whole article, but there's a lovely bit where they're talking about the Royal Albert Hall and this gig, the Teenage Cancer Trust gig in 2012. They're backstage. Was it Macca says to Ronnie Wood, you should come on and play guitar on Get Back? And this image of Weller behind him going, me too, me too. It's wonderful that you've painted in there, or that Paul's told you this story. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I think that my feeling about Paul is that he's becoming more and more open to actually taking the mickey out of himself, which may not always have been the case, or indeed when it was the case, it might have been misunderstood in the past. I mean, a lot of the humour in the Star Council, they are fond of saying, was missed or misconstrued. Maybe the problem there was making Jerusalem, giving sense of humour a bad name, perhaps. but no, I would say, if you're talking to him now, the last time I interviewed him, I kind of suggested that, he was much more relaxed, much less wary of people like myself, like music journalists.
Yeah.
I think, part of that is just confidence and age and just like being comfortable in yourself and just thinking, sort of not feeling like someone's got your number.
Somebody's not trying to trip you up and that kind of thing, which you feel maybe is not the case now.
There's also that. I mean, I do have friends amongst music journalists who were phoned up by Paul Weller and asked to have a fight. In the 90s, that was not an irregular occurrence. And I think that Paul always found it hard to understand why someone would write something about him that they would not necessarily have said to his face. And I think probably a lot of people out there in pod and listener land would probably think the same way. It's like, who's this guy, Danny Eccleston, saying my hair's crap and, my songs are rubbish? But actually, he would have accepted if I'd have said his songs were rubbish, because he would say that's fair comment.
Right.
But like sort of, as we know, a lot of music writing in the old school weeklies in the 80s and 90s was fairly on the edge, sort of it regularly tipped over into ridicule and abuse, and I think that alienated Paul from the music press for quite a long time. He's fond of saying these days that you lot are all right now or not as bad as you used to be, which I think is probably fair enough. And certainly from where he's standing, it's fair enough.
There's two other bits. One is Hello Goodbye. You chat with Mick Talbot, our mate, and the Style Council in there. And also Bill Smith, who's on a future episode of the podcast talking about the Jam record sleeves as well. But there's one other thing which is always a joy. It's that cover-mounted CD. And you created this with Paul as well, because you can see the track listing is like there's P.P. Arnold, which Steve Craddock produced and Weller wrote with and worked on the last album. I think she was on one of Paul's albums in the past too. Black Pumas, I've seen as a recommendation from Paul before. Stone Foundation, Teenage Waitress. Daniel's been on the podcast. Declan O'Rourke, Richard Hawley, Erlen Cooper. So Paul's clearly worked with you to create this lovely CD that cover mounts the issue as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we asked him for a long list of tracks and to peer slightly behind the magic curtain of the CD compilation game. You can't always get what you want. So a load of major record labels won't let you have their tracks these days. But Paul said from the start, he said, look, I'll pick loads of stuff that you can get. He said, because I'm not interested in having all that major label stuff on it anyway. I want to have new and, less well-known stuff, So that's why we called it Into Tomorrow. Obviously a Weller reference, but also kind of about the spirit of the CD. But there's also kind of, again, it has lots of strange stuff on it. Well, not lots of strange stuff, but enough strange stuff to give you that sense of kind of Paul's kind of eccentric and eclectic taste. So the Third Ear Band are on there. So if you don't know anything about the Third Ear Band, check out the CD and see whether that's something you might want to investigate further. And there's this great new Portuguese psychedelic band. They're called Beautified Junkyards, which is a great name. And their track's called Cosmorama, and that's on there. And that's on the Ghostbox label. So again, a Ghostbox reference. But it's really a mind-blowing track. And they're a band really that I can't imagine any Mojo reader not enjoying in some respect.
Paul's collaboration has come up a lot on this podcast and how much he likes working with others and always around music. But the fact that he's created this with you and it's a real, like I say, musical journey between the things that he loves from past and present, because so much of it's looking forward and then introducing us to new artists, but so much, I can't wait to dig into the Third Ear Band. I've not heard anything about that. And I'm really interested to see what that is and whether I'll like it. And the story around the sadness.
Yeah, don't blame me if you don't, though, Dan.
I'll blame Paul. The Funkadelic, the sadness and madness of Maggot Brain. I did a little bit of research on that earlier. And that sounds like a nuts story on its own about George Clinton and their brother and all sorts. So it would be really interesting to dig into that too. I've got two final questions for you, Danny. Question number one, you're allowed one Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. It can be Paul Weller solo, the Jam, or the Style Council. Which one's it going to be?
It's going to be Long Hot Summer by the Style Council. The 12-inch, because it goes on for longer, I get more value for money. It was just a key record at a certain time in my life. I mean, there's loads of other tracks I could pick. At least half of 22 Dreams. I always say that You Do Something to Me from Stanley Road is a standard, like it should be. It's like sort of jazz guys should just play that song, and maybe they will be in 10, 20 years' time. I'd like to think so, because I think it's that good a composition. But, I think that sometimes you just have to go with the thing that like hit you at a certain point in your life. And for me, that's Long Hot Summer.
And when you revisit that song, do you see the earlobes with Paul and Mick lying down by the canal or whatever it was?
Oh, definitely. I know it was filmed in Cambridge, the video, but right. I do say to Paul, I only went to Oxford in order to do some punting because of the Long Hot Summer video. And he looked at me as if to say, I don't fucking believe you. But and maybe he shouldn't, but that's what I said to him.
Final question. So the purpose of this podcast, obviously it's lovely talking to people like yourself, but really it's for me to be able to get in front of Paul, have a chat with him at Black Barn and get that interview that I never managed in my radio career. If it happens, what should I ask him? What should I talk to him about?
Oh, right. Okay. That's a big question. I think that's really hard. It's really hard to interview Paul Weller because because there's been a lot of not because he's not not because he won't answer your questions or anything, but actually it's hard to find something new to ask him. You know what I always say to like journalists when I'm sending them out to interview people? I always say, just think before you go. Sounds like an obvious thing, but just think about the one thing you've really always wanted to know. Put aside the idea it's an interview, or it's like for radio or TV or for a magazine or whatever. Like, sort of like go in really honest with that question that you really want to know the answer to, because then that's about, it's literally about what you want to know. And I think that's a kind of really honest place to come from. The other thing I always say is, ask a stupid question, which means don't presume that, just because you know so much about this artist, that there's not something really basic that you should ask that you need to know. So, for instance, the thing I asked him when I interviewed him around On Sunset, which I didn't put in the piece actually, but I'm saving for eventually to use in a piece, is I did ask him, how do you sing and chew gum at the same time, Paul? And he looks at me, and he looks, because he does that, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He does that.
Yeah.
Chews away, sings a song, chews the gum. How do you do that without swallowing it? And he just looked at me and just said, lots of practice.
Oh, brilliant.
Don't ask him that one, because that's mine.
That's your one. Yeah. If it all goes tits up, I can ask about guitar pedals.
Yes, that's always my advice. Yes.
Danny, this has been a joy. Thank you so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to really get stuck into the new issue of MOJO magazine, I have to say. It looks fantastic. So well done on that, mate.
Enjoy.
My thanks once again to Danny. That was lovely. The new issue of MOJO magazine with guest editor Mr. Paul Weller is a must-read for any fans. It's available right now. You'll find a link in the show notes for this podcast. On my next episode, we head across the English Channel to France and chat to Christophe Vellon, the man behind the fabulous music of Le Super Amant. Not only is he a massive Paul Weller fan since he was a young mod, but he also got to remix one of Paul's tunes for the On Sunset Remix EP last year and was due to support Paul on the European tour before COVID put things on hold. Don't forget to share this episode on social media, leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us to find new listeners to the show. You can find me on Twitter @WellerFanPod or on Instagram and Facebook. It's @Paul Weller Fan Podcast. I'll see you next time.